going to not go around and do introductions and just get started. And then we've got plenty of time, hopefully, at the end for discussion. And Carina, go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Carina Wyborn. I'm with the College of Forestry and Conservation at the University of Montana in the postdoc. Did I already say that? That's probably enough. Thanks.
So Carina and I are gonna kind of tag team and co-present today, and we're in different states, so hopefully this will work out. So to introduce what we're doing here today, as one of the activities of the North Central Climate Science Center Adaptation Foundational Science Areas, and this particular Adaptation and Decision-Making Working Group, Dennis Ojima provided a small amount of funding for one of the projects that the city is funding through our last solicitation round to hold a team integration workshop. And a lot of the same people were part of this workshop that we're going to present today were also here at the workshop we had back in April of 2013 here in Fort Collins that was getting a bunch of members of this working group together to start to think about a plan or a research agenda and how we can collaborate together, and then also that they were at the National Adaptation Forum in Denver that was that same week. This is really an evolution of team building and sort of thinking about this type of social, ecological, climate integration work over the last, half year to a year. Today, what we're going to present is introduce the project that this workshop was for, and sort of the background and context of this particular research project, the process that led up to the workshop, and this really occurred from June through of 2013, and then what actually happened in the workshop itself, the content of the workshop, which was on August 22nd and 23rd, and subsequently how we have followed up with some of the workshop outputs, basically now and moving forward, and then we'll open it up for just feedback and questions. And there are several of the workshop organizers and participants on this call. So after Carina and I present, we definitely want to open it up to you guys to jump in with anything else that you think that we might have missed, or key points to cover, or any other discussion points that you'd like to do today, and then open it up for feedback from the rest of the group. So just a little an introduction about the philosophy that led to this workshop in particular, which most of you have heard, but for people that might have heard this before, this is really sort of the North Central Climate Science Center philosophy, which we call RAMP, Resource for Vulnerability Assessment, Adaptation, and Mitigation Planning. And the idea is that instead of the CSC just being a mechanism for funding for projects, that we also provide resources and capacity to support those funded activities. And this adaptation working group is in that vein. And this diagram you see now is our kind of newly developed visualization. When the shutdown happened, we had this sort of fortuitous love to have a science planning meeting instead of that with the foundational science leads and Jeff and Dennis, our two directors, to really think through where we are with this revamp idea and where we're going with it. It is really kind of moving more into that integration direction of our three foundational science areas of climate, physical climate, ecosystems impact, and human adaptation and decision making. So the idea of this diagram is that instead of it being sort of this linear process where, the climate models feed the ecosystem models, and then the output of those feed adaptation, it's a more integrated approach where we're actually including the social science analysis of social systems and social ecological systems, which is, again, what we're trying to do through this adaptation working group and building this kind of community of practice. And so the center that this workshop can be sort of a bit of a model or an example that to some extent could be replicated or transferred to other projects as we move forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris to talk through the project.
Okay, Shannon. So this project emerged from a solicitation that the Climate Science Centre sent out earlier on this year. I'm sure many of you are aware of it. In the initial solicitation, 3 different project teams had put in proposals to work on roughly similar issues it's sort of down in the southwest Colorado area, so in the Gunnison Basin and in the San Juan Basin. And so after the initial solicitation, the Climate Science Centre saw the potential for sort of synergies between these 3 projects. So asked if we would consider putting together a joint proposal, which the project teams agreed to do. But there was a reasonably short time frame between when we were asked to sort of submit a proposal and when the full proposal was due. So it was we developed this sort of set level goal that you can see up on the slide. So we wanted to build knowledge of social ecological vulnerability. We're going to be creating scenarios and ecological models to facilitate decision making or uncertainty, developing and prioritizing adaptation strategies, and the adaptive capacities and institutional arrangements to move those strategies into practice, and then to document best practices for climate science into decision making. So we've got this set of high-level project goals and methodologies, which I'll talk about in a moment. But in the rush to get the proposal in, we sort of didn't get to thinking about some of that conceptual work behind how we were going to integrate these different approaches, and then how also those high-level goals would be developed into research questions. And so at the moment, what we're doing is developing these goals into research questions. And I should say that the goals that are outlaid there have been agreed by our local stakeholders. And so now the research team is developing the questions, which will then get taken back to the stakeholders. Let's say on that slide. So then the goal of this workshop was to be doing that kind of integrated thinking about what kind of a conceptual framework we would need to bring together these different approaches. There was also a work that was kind of aimed at getting us along that next stage of the process of developing a shared lexicon and team building and relationship building amongst this group of people who don't have a background history of working together. I really wanted to understand sort of how the conceptual and analytical framework that we would be developing was going to fit with the proposed project methodologies, and think we would move that framework forwards, and that is part of the ongoing discussion, which we are still working on now and will probably still be working on for a while. So, next slide, please, Shannon. Thank you. So this is sort of a rough overview of the process that we adopted to develop the framework. So had a project team meeting in early June, and a small workshop planning group was formed. And between June and August, in the sort of lead up to the workshop, that planning group had weekly phone calls. And each week we reviewed 2 conceptual framework papers. So the working group represented the range of different sort of social, climate, ecological science represented in the project team, but then also we had sort of readers from academic institutions in the project team, and then also from some of the practitioners. The role of the working group was really to kind of provide a strong base of knowledge and background understanding of the key papers that we would be reviewing to go into the workshop. So because we'd had these sort of in-depth discussions about papers, that provided a really strong foundation for the 2 days of the workshop. Also, it highlighted and kind of ironed out some of the potential tensions that are among the project team, and that kind of could have been up time in what was a sort of workshop with very high ambitions. And then through this process, we developed an evaluation matrix Shannon's going to talk about in a little bit, which sort of based around which the kind of the meat of the workshop on those days, which we focused on. And we formed a small working group to sort of focus finding the workshop outputs and think about how we would take them forward. And that group sort of refined the framework that was developed during the workshop, and then and work has been sent out for review to the project team, and then we're going to be meeting next week, middle of next week, to sort of revisit the framework and the research questions and how to actually turn this into a project. Please, Shannon.
Okay. Can I just remind people too, if you don't have yourself muted on your phone, to please mute yourself. There's a little bit of background noise that we're hearing. Thank you.
On this slide, you can see the papers that were sort of the kind of intellectual grunt behind this workshop. So the top 5 papers that are listed there are sort of the seminal conceptual framework papers that we reviewed. We selected the papers to represent the sort of range of different aspects of this project. So it's papers on sort of vulnerability and adaptive capacity, adaptation, resilience. There's the Ostrom paper in there about institutional analysis. And we also included an additional paper, which is the Vogel 2007 paper, which is sort of focused around the process of doing research that connects science with practice. So all of the papers that were selected because they're highly cited papers and they're kind of key in shaping the thinking in this field. And then the last 2 papers on the list there, the Cross-Allen and the Tompkins, Dew and Brown paper, they to kind of represent the stakeholder engagement methods that were proposed in the project proposal. The Cross framework is the adaptation for conservation targets, and then the scope-based process, which I'm going to talk about next. But the important points to make here was that really the goal of the workshop was to think about how we would sort of conceptually and analytically knit together those 2 stakeholder engagement methodologies, situating them within this kind of broader field of what is kind of best practice, I guess, for lack of a better, and understanding about where the research is at around how to kind of conduct a participatory research project. And part of it is really about looking at the sort of social science components to really analytically do this, rather than just kind of smash together these 2 different approaches without thinking about how they would fit together and how analytically we would forward with the research. Next slide, please, Shannon. Unless there was else you wanted to add there.
It's just highlighting what you just said and reiterating that distinction between stakeholder engagement versus an analytical social science approach. And what I observed, get used interchangeably, and that's problematic because stakeholder engagement is a very different thing than social science. Social science is to understand the social components, the human system itself, as opposed to stakeholder engagement, which is, science, you bring in stakeholders to get feedback, you have workshops, whatever, and you know, hopefully they use the results of your science. So that distinction, I think, is really important to make, and it's one that we, I think, need to get better at making that distinction.
We're going to go into too much detail about these project methods because we really wanted to kind of move on, but just to roughly outline, these are the two project methods that were discussed in the proposal. So one of the proposals that was put in before we became an integrated project was using the adaptation for conservation targets framework, and then another one used this scale iterative scenario building process. And so these methods, focus on sort of different things. While the conservation targets framework is it's a conservation planning tool which kind of draws on the existing knowledge of stakeholders in it and provides a sort of step-by-step platform to bring stakeholders together to kind of through a conservation planning approach to kind of consider how climate change might impact on existing conservation targets. And its sort of strength is in its simplicity, in that it's been designed to be easily adopted by managers, but it's very conservation focused, so it doesn't have much consideration of sort of the social context of the conservation planning and conservation targets. With that, doesn't really consider sort of adaptive capacity and sort of barriers to adopting the conservation targets and strategies outlined. And then the iterative scenario building methodology, it's a sort of in development of an approach by the University of Montana team. And originally designed as an assessment tool rather than a tool to sort of work with decision makers to develop adaptation strategies. And so through reviews and focus groups, this method engages diverse stakeholders with narrative scenarios to discuss social and ecological vulnerabilities, adaptive capacity, and sort of the institutional context and governance issues related to adaptation. But it wasn't designed to be used to work with decision makers, and it's quite a key process of interviews and focus groups that requires really dedicated buy-in from participants. And it provides a kind of detailed kind of modeling of ecological vulnerabilities that the ACT framework does. And it's also very forwards-looking, so it's not grounded in a strong kind of baseline assessment of existing body and adaptive capacities. And so the project proposal was to kind of integrate these two different approaches to build on their strengths and through the sort of integration and more overcome their weaknesses to develop a sort of integrated approach to understanding social and ecological vulnerabilities and adaptations. Over to you now, Shannon.
Hi, thanks, Carina. So getting into the workshop itself, so what Carina did for the workshop was we created a matrix that is to provide our critical evaluation of the frameworks. The matrix was based on a report that came out of the U.S. National Climate Assessment that's going to be released this spring, the 2013 U.S. National Climate Assessment that Dennis and I were both pretty heavily involved in. They had a workshop in, I think, 2011 that was really to help provide guidelines for vulnerability assessments for the National Climate Assessment, and that was a group of course, you know, some of the leading experts on climate vulnerability and adaptation assessment in the country. And so what we used the guidelines in that report and kind of adapted that to make our own matrix so that the workshop could really be more structured and in our evaluation of each of these papers. And the bullets on the side are what we sort of had as the main criteria points, and I won't go through all of them. You can read them yourselves, but basically what we did was we put each of these criteria across the top of the matrix, and then along the vertical axis, we listed each of the papers so that in the workshop we could have breakout groups where we discussed each of the papers, and we discussed two sets of papers in each breakout group. and then had two separate breakout groups where we put the strengths and weaknesses of each of those papers on the matrix, which we drew on a whiteboard, and we would come back together as a group after those breakout groups and decide sort of collectively what the highlights of those strengths and weaknesses were for each of those papers. After we did that matrix exercise, what we did was we developed a set of guiding principles based on those discussions for what we felt as a group covered all of these different components: the scale, the research approach, dealing with complexity, outcomes, etc., and the critical considerations that should go into the framework. So as you can see here, really the idea of capturing cross-scale interactions. So both temporally and spatially, the interactions between the place-based research and higher scale processes of, say, governance, for example, such as state-level policies and politics and national-level policies and politics and so on. The explicit consideration of each of the disciplinary areas, the social, the ecological, and the climate, and those feedbacks and interactions between them. The institutional dynamics and processes of decision-making, the interaction in the participatory research approach that we're using for this project. We needed to develop useful and usable science, acknowledge and bound complexity, and the explicit consideration of uncertainty, which last one was really something that we felt like was a big weakness across most of the papers, that consideration of uncertainty, both in an analytical sense and how you communicate uncertainty, was something that wasn't as prominent as we would like it to be in this framework. And by doing this, by setting up the principles that really helped guide us for how we would create the actual framework itself. So the principles were developed at the end of the first day after we reviewed all the papers. Brainstorm where everybody identified one key thing they wanted the framework to do, which is how we came up with this set of guiding principles. And then on the second day of the workshop, we actively developed this framework and making sure that each of the guidelines that we out was included in that framework. So we created, sticky notes of all the different guiding principles and put them on the board and played around with the figure and so on. Afterwards, we've continued to refine this, and I'll get into that in a bit. So, basic step doing was start with the Turner et al. Framework, which is a highly cited and heavily used framework. And in fact, if you remember the people who were on the first webinar that we had with this adaptation working group back in February of 2013, the presentation Olia Wilhelmy gave, that was also the basis of that framework that she presented. So this is an attractive framework. One of the reasons is because it really gets at the sort of nested scales of influence. I was talking about that the place-based scale is sort of nested in these larger scales of dynamics. Both geographically and temporally. That the Turner framework articulates this relationship between exposure, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity, although in the Turner framework they use resilience where a lot of other people use adaptive capacity, so we kind of tweaked that. The breadth of the framework enabled integration across the core social, ecological, climate, and institutional dynamics. After we sort of used that as our foundation, we took those stickies and made sure that, that was sort of represented and kind of placed them in this framework as our kind of first draft at what framework might actually look like, both visually and in a sort of conceptual narrative way. And then everyone in the group, if they, could see themselves in that framework, if it captured the discussion of the past 2 days, and they saw where they would fit into that framework, because of course it's very important that whatever this framework is, that everyone on the project team can actually see where they fit into that framework. This is the draft framework, and yes, it's very messy, and yes, it's overwhelming, and we get that. It's actually messier at one point, and definitely, still a work in progress, but we wanted to make sure that we sort of got everything in there, that this was the overall brain dump of everything we came up with at the workshop, and still largely contains the structure of the Turner et al. Framework, but modifications in the sort of conceptualization of some of the processes driving vulnerability and adaptive capacity were tweaked, and also including a consideration of governance dynamics, and actually, not surprisingly, and back to the framework that Tommy presented, was a similar in that framework that we had developed at NCAR. So then really again emphasizing the analytical pieces of these cross-scale dynamics, the linkages between scales, the nested scales, and adaptive capacity that happens also at multiple scales. The place, so as you in this framework, it follows the Turner framework, for those of you that are familiar with it, where the sort of place-based component is that middle blue space, the large regional is the yellow space, and the green is the sort of global dynamics. And zoom place, because this is really where the focus of the research is going to be. It's place-based research. The analysis of this research is really going to be about these basins in southwest Colorado, the Gunnison Basin and the Seminal Basin. And the components of this part of the framework are, again, this sort of iteration between projections and understanding the historical and baseline stressors. So you can see that in the red here, which this was something that one of the things that we as a group really identified was something that needs to be added to the methodologies that were originally proposed, because when you just do areas without having that really good understanding of current historical and current sort of baseline stressors, then it's very difficult when you're doing scenarios to tie it back into what decision makers are actually dealing with and the leverage points that they actually have today and in the near future to make adaptations. Oops. And then, sorry, we're looking at Ryan's computer on the screen. It just went off, so that distracted me. Let's see, what did I not cover? Another aspect that we, really felt was important that wasn't in the previous conceptualization was the idea of a focus on differential vulnerability and adaptive capacity. In other words, the problems of when you take a kind of broader systems approach to systems is that, systems are evenly distributed in terms of vulnerability and adaptive capacity. So, for example, in southwest Colorado, you've got a mix of, economic sectors. You've got a couple of tribes that are in that region, and even in those two different tribes, they have very different capacities and vulnerabilities for responses. So that's something that we felt was really important and explicit in this framework. And the explicit consideration of decision-making processes and needs, both from an analytical perspective and from a practical perspective in shaping the research. so the next, after we created this framework, was a follow-up work group was created at the WAP. Every group has been meeting regularly again to really take the outcomes of the workshop and turn them into something that we could use going forward. So some of the outputs that came out of the workshop were a set of key terms and acronyms to be used in this project, writing up of those guiding principles, clean matrices. You know, we ended up with a set of a whole bunch of different matrices, but then we had this big one that would make sure that we still had it as a reference point. Creating the actual diagram, that was something that was created after the workshop, and then writing up the actual explanation, the narrative of the framework. And then we subsequently sent that out to the rest of the team for comments and feedback, which we've gotten some of so far, and we're working through those. And as Carina mentioned earlier, we'll discuss them next week. The team is meeting again in Boulder next week. That's our team meeting, but on the agenda we have to some time set aside to revisit the framework, how to move forward with the framework in the context of the research questions. And as Carina said, the research questions are still in the development phase. The proposals were really, set these kind of high-level objectives, and then the sort of broad-level research questions being developed now. And in this type of a participatory approach for vulnerability and adaptation assessment, we really start with those broad-level research questions, and as you engage the stakeholders more in the research process, those questions become more refined as time goes on. So then ultimately, we recognize that at some point we're going to have to think through translation of what we're doing with this framework for the stakeholder advisory group. I think it's important to make the distinction between this framework as an analytical framework and the social science piece, and again, that stakeholder engagement, because this framework is not the framework that we would take to the stakeholders. That would be insane. Just like you wouldn't show stakeholders the mathematical equations that go into a climate model, you also would not show stakeholders this formula that goes into the thinking for the social science. And with that said, there's also a lot of other stages in developing social science that still need to happen. I mean, this is still, we're at this kind of high-level conceptual analytical framework, but we still have to, go through and think through what pieces of this can we actually do within the context of this project, within, the team is here, within the funding that is here, and how do we operationalize that with specific methods to analyze each of those conceptual pieces. So this is really, the evolution of this sort of scholarly thinking for this project, that at some point, just like with climate models, you have to translate what the outcomes of those climate models are for the stakeholder groups. We will have to do the same thing for this framework that we're developing. So I think and now, I said in the beginning, I think we'd like to open it up to others who are actually involved in this process and who are on the project team to chime in with anything else you think would be, important to discuss today. And then after doing that for about maybe 5 or 10 minutes, then we can open it up to the whole group for feedback. So, as a group, again, is this issue, how do we move this forward? How do we operationalize this in the context of the research questions and the project itself? And again, this is an ongoing discussion, but we'd really appreciate feedback from this working group. So from the team, would you like to chime in at this point? Or before we do that, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think that we should let the rest of the team speak.
All right. Dan, Rina, I don't know if Betsy's on. Anybody? Did you guys want to add?
Yes. I thought you covered the process pretty well. I'm just trying to think back and remember. I wasn't prepared for comments. Rudy and Nina chime in if they want to.
This is Rudy. Rudy hasn't been able to get on the call yet, so no, I think this covered things pretty well. I missed the first day of the workshop because I was in another meeting, so I wasn't there for everything. The emphasis at the end of this conversation about how to really turn into actionable research, I think, is really an interesting conversation that we need to have. But I think that the workshop got us to a place where we could see some of the pieces to think a little more systematically about how we might do this. How we might take it apart and then hopefully how we can put it all back together again at the end. So I have questions too. I don't want to jump forward to questions before, but I'm curious to know what people who weren't able to be at the workshop. So I'm looking forward to that part of this conversation as well. Yeah,
definitely. Agreed. So, did anybody else want to jump in who was part of the workshop before we get up to questions from the group? If that is the case, so questions or comments that weren't involved in the workshop?
Just curious if you could say a little bit about you have a box on social learning. What'd you see in that box? What'd you glean from the other papers?
Let's see. Social learning in the governance. Yeah, question. So I'm trying to think. I think that social learning, if I'm remembering correctly, wasn't actually part of any of the papers that we reviewed. I think, and anybody else jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that social is one of those things that we, as we were thinking through the other aspects of science and the governance and the decision making, that social learning was an important aspect of that, and several of us, myself included, have done social learning research. But I'm pretty sure it wasn't in any of the papers that we reviewed. Am I saying that right, Carina?
About it, I feel like I'm not because I'm making this assumption because a lot of the resilience literature talks of social learning all the time. I feel like it's mentioned in the Chapin paper, but I think part of the discussion was sort of amongst the stakeholders within the region, but also social learning within the research team as we kind of sort of learn to integrate and go as we go along, because I think that was sort of what we were trying to get at with that. But I think the social learning is one of the things that sort of, boxes on the conceptual framework is a large black box that we may end up delving into. And what we were hoping to do with this kind of is capture a whole range of different processes or kind of concepts or content that this research project could focus on, sort of still to be defined which ones we will focus on and how we would be conceptualizing them. Project team have anything to say about that?
Carina, you captured it pretty well, the essence of it. When we were coming into the workshop, we were doing a lot of learning. I'm coming from the climate side, and I had a lot of learning to do, how to integrate the different sectors and the science related to the different sectors. But you're talking about the learning that will happen amongst the stakeholders. and between the stakeholders and us. So I think you captured it as I felt it was.
Yeah, and thanks, Yaz. And one of the things that we didn't go into, we didn't actually whether talking about it or not, but as part of this project, we're also doing a science of the science, quote unquote, and so that's really sort of documenting the thing that happens, again, both within the context of the team and broader stakeholder engagement. And so there was a mini survey that was done before the workshop of the project team itself. In part, that survey was to sort of elucidate the different perspectives and vantage points that we all come into this project with in terms of how we define some of the concepts, what we think, the outcomes should be, what the nature of the stakeholder engagement with the research team should be, et cetera, and that's actually laying the groundwork for a continual sort of monitoring of how this project evolves, both inside the research team and the broader stakeholder engagement. So I know that was reiterating some of it, but I wanted to bring up the fact that the surveying is happening and this sort of science of the science is happening. We talked about maybe doing a webinar at some point down the line specifically focused on that, because we ended up taking it out because we thought it might be too much information because it's already a lot of information that we're covering.
And then this is Bill Travis. Am I mute?
You're Bill.
Oh, great. So this isn't quite, I don't think it's quite Linda Joyce's question about social learning, but we're sitting here and we've just come out of the lab analyzing her 25 stakeholder interviews. We are framing it sort of upstream of this project. Maybe it goes into the upper left red box on basins and stressors. We're framing the perception work on how people know their climate, what they understand about their climate. So there are several elements of that. And one thing that comes out clearly is, this won't surprise anybody, but dates or years or particularly memorable events, especially happen to fall on holidays, by the way.
Christmas.
There's that. How engaged. So the ranchers are talking a little different story about timing and how they learn when green up occurs. So in a way, I hadn't called it that, but we're trying to capture the learning that's already occurred of how people learn their climate.
Yep. Thanks.
We'll try to think of, and we'll try to think about it a little bit more that way, because we step in at one point and say, oh, you've been here for 10 years, you've been here for 40 years,
right.
About it. But we need to think about then how they update their learning, which is the loop, first single loop and double loop learning models. In a sense, it's almost like a Bayesian updating. How do people update what they think as they collect new information or as the climate changes? So I'll just say that. Right. Thanks.
No, I'm glad I chimed in with that, Bill, because we definitely very much look forward to seeing what you and Katie come up with from that analysis, and hope that, discussed, we can really use some insights from Katie's research to inform this project. Bob, I believe that was Bob Goff. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. There were a couple of tribes, certainly in the area. I don't know if they were engaged in the workshop, but we started doing it. So what I've been doing is engage some of the tribes down in the South right now around energy issues and some resiliency issues. But so I've been talking to you about that offline. But in this zooming into place governance, are you looking at interactions within that governance column? Rapid social learning amongst teachers in South Dakota, the October 5th and 5th blizzard hit, and 1,000 head of cattle were lost. They want more information sooner, quicker, understanding it, and the national percentages in the red states have changed in terms of what people believe, at least at this moment, with climate change and global warming, believing that it's happening and that there's a factor in it. Is that kind of thing to be worked in up and down that governance chain that you have?
Right. As Carina said, and I think I said something similar, at this point, we're still not real sure what that's going to look like in terms of taking this framework and operationalizing it in the context of this project, and as the research questions evolve and as there's an assessment of the resources, the capacity within the research team, both financially and the human capacity to utilize these component parts. I personally would like to see that happen. I think what you just described is a essential element of understanding adaptation processes, but then this is an evolving project, and so if possible, I think be done. We just mix of all the different things that the pieces we might break off of this. That's still not determined, but I really would love to follow up with you to talk about the work you're doing with the tribes. I know I was on, or someone from, I don't see anybody listed from the group down Southwest, MTAS, or maybe Carina, one of you guys can speak up. I know there was some tribal engagement in terms of the early stages of the proposed development. They haven't been involved yet in the meetings and workshops, but it's something that we definitely hope to include. I know that was something that was attractive about this project, was that it does have a tribal engagement element. So I'm sure the team would really enjoy talking to you about the work that you're doing.
Well, comment on that is the pace at which these governance change, adapt, and move are very different from institutions to that social learning, and it would be important to get some rates of change factors considered in things can move more quickly than others.
I totally agree with that. I think that's an excellent comment. Do you have any more to say about that? I mean, when you talk about rates of change of some of these institutions, I think we would say change at various rates because of different constraints and incentives and all that kind of stuff. But thoughts about how you think about it or how you talk, measure it? I mean, I'm just wondering if you have any other thoughts about that.
Well, institutions and, the world not sit on the back of a turtle, but Congress certainly seems to be. And they are way behind, I think, where a lot of the public is, for very vested interest reasons. And we've seen that more in most of the institutions. And politics becomes a slow responder to actual and learning compared to where the institutions have been vested. So that's an area we're looking to see how we might find.
Yeah, I think so. I thought it was me.
Sorry.
Here.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We were looking to see where there may be opportunities or in the armor, if you will, to find places where inroads in terms of the social learning and moving adaptation and opportunities forward might be. And it's the advantage of the differential rates of speed, if you will, in these different boxes.
And by clarification, are you, when you say Southwest tribes, are you specifically doing work on the ground with either the Southern Ute or the Ute tribes?
This is Jeff, with respect to the response that came from the proposal, because we did ask to have a little more detail on the tribal engagement, and it is Scow with Ute Mountain Utes and Tom Johnson They're working directly with them. Participation will be invited to the first when they have the San Juan meeting in the region. And with respect to Bob's comment, we need to. There's different scales that different groups are on, and it's possibly useful then that we have this as a project to work that relationship, and they're bringing it on existing relationships. So I think that we'll see what happens with the South Colorado and give it 3 years, but any chance we get to use lessons learned for tribes would of course be welcome. But they are pretty well with those two, and we have 3 years to watch unfold and respect those different temporal that they're going to be operating at.
I just wanted to, Jeff just summed up everything that I was just about to say. The tribes have been engaged throughout and to varying degrees have been ready to sign on to what has been put forward, in part because they move at different timescales, as Bob has pointed out. And I mean, we have a stakeholder advisory group which we formed and are still in the process of engaging with them as in sort of since the project has been funded. So it's there and it's a work in progress. The things that I just wanted to add to that conversation about sort of timescales and institutional change, I think one of the things I'm interested in exploring through this project is sort of what are mechanisms, what institutional mechanisms available to kind of to developing and implementing adaptation strategies, but also where those mechanisms are not available, what are the processes that need to be kind of changed or worked on to enable that decision making to happen. It's not just I think get kind of caught up on thinking about what particular adaptation strategies we want to develop without really looking at what sort of some of the more boring kind of administrative mechanisms that are required to enable adaptive decision making over time, because that kind of gets those different processes, mechanisms, and is also a way to deal with the kind of the uncertainty that's in making adaptation decisions.
Did you have another comment?
I was down there October 1st, and administrations, the tribal administration changed over to a new chairman and new people. So I heard the date of your workshop, but it would be something to check in with for up who would be the reps and the like.
Try Southern Ute or Ute Mountain Ute?
Mountain Ute.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, worth mentioning, we didn't say that we were supposed to have a workshop next week with the stakeholders down in Gunnison and Durango, but the government shutdown set us back, and so that's been delayed. And, I think that's a blessing and a curse. I mean, I think interactions with the stakeholders earlier than later is always good, but by the same token, we still got some of our sort of getting the house in order to do. So, trade-off. So the meeting that's happening next week, instead of being with the stakeholders down in the region, is going to be involved with the research team. And I think I can't remember what the plan is to have that meeting down there. You guys, what are we looking at? December, something like that?
It would be December. It might be January. It kind of depends on funding and budget and continuing resolution and those kinds of things, but it would be the earliest. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what we had talked about.
Yeah, I think that is the current affairs.
Sarah, can I? Great, you guys. It's definitely really useful to think about. I know some of the articles, not all of them, and so it'll be nice to go back and look at them in light of this. And so I really appreciate the thinking to it and working through it. One of the things that Heather and I and the Task Climate Change for the AAA, for the Anthropology Association, have been thinking about earlier this fall, and is relevant here, is what the definitions of things like vulnerability and adaptation and how it differs from adjustment, or all of these other things. And you were mentioning a list of acronyms and other kinds of common language tools that you were just wondering if there's a way for us to access to that, to take a look at that and think through some of those issues, because particularly terms that turn up everywhere but are often used differently can be problematic.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, Sarah, because I knew someone was going to ask that question, and the first answer is that the team whole needs to agree that we're ready to sort of put these out to the group to get feedback in some sort of wiki or online page or something like that. But certainly at some point the idea is that will happen. I'm just not sure what mechanism that's going to occur in, but I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in about what other people's thoughts are about it. That is certainly the hope, is that we can get additional feedback and share the results of this with the broader group here, broader adaptation working group for the CSC. Did anyone on the team want to make a comment about that? Nina, I know you've kind of been thinking about this.
Oops. Can you repeat that? I'm just kind of didn't.
It was basically the first question. You mean?
Yes.
The issue of if these materials that we created out of this workshop, like the terms and the acronyms and all the French stuff, if that can be shared with this broader group for them to and think about and give feedback, and because these discussions are happening in other venues, like Sarah was mentioning, the AAA, the Anthropology Association of America. I'm probably getting the order wrong, but
in my head, I mean, I guess I wouldn't want to be the final word on this, and maybe we can talk about this next week at our meeting. I mean, off the top of my head, I don't think that there's anything that we've produced so far that we couldn't share with anybody. But I'd be interested in whether anybody on the team thinks anything different, and if we should talk about it next week when we're together. But overall, I think that it's that we could share that would help people to provide comments and help us to think about this. That would be a good thing, probably.
And again, my more specific question was, part about the sharing of that and consider how other people are handling the issues, but even more particularly, what you were just about these definitional, particularly the ones that, as I said, turn up everywhere: adaptation versus adjustment, vulnerability. That you thoughts or comments on the process of coming to an internal agreement about the definitions of those, because they are quite variable.
Yeah, we actually, what we did for the workshop and for the team was we came up with a set of definitions that were largely based on the National Climate Assessment definitions, again, this upcoming National Climate Assessment, which are largely based on the IPCC definitions, and also end up using the Chapin definitions, sort of with a list that was a combination of those two sources, and then sort of adding and revising accordingly. But the kind of main sources, and we a set of definitions that we put up on a white sheet on the wall for the workshop. we didn't send, and I think actually for better, because I think you can end up getting caught up in long discussions of definitions, but we kind of took those definitions as a starting point, but gave everyone the opportunity subsequently, and this is again ongoing, to tweak them if there's something that doesn't seem to be in there. Like this idea of differential vulnerability and adaptive capacity, that was one of the things that, a lot of these definitions, they talk about these things in terms of systems, like I mentioned earlier, and really making sure that differentiality component is built into the terminology and things like that. But that's kind of the broad brush of what we did. Have something to chime in there?
Well, I say that the definitions that we end up with, I think we drew from all these different works, and we also had to sort of smooth some of the logical differences within the group. And I think that everyone came in with the understanding that had to be done in order to see something like this work. And so I think even though individually, for example, myself, I may not particularly subscribe to a certain definition, I think that right now that they are to think with. I think most of these are definitions for us to work in interdisciplinary ways, and I think that was a big thrust behind what we came up with.
Yeah.
That, in some sense, that process is of value itself.
Yes, definitely.
I just wanted to add in there as well, Shannon and Dan have captured much of what I had to say, but part of what I was wanting to do as well was maintain some kind of consistency with the National Climate Assessment framings and language in the sort of idea that perhaps in the future this project can be feeding into that. But that we have some kind of parking lot issues, and some of the parking lot issues revolve around some of those questions about how these particular term words are going to be interpreted in ways that will enable sort of consistent and rigorous analysis across both social and ecological sort of system parts of the project. I think that's all I had to say there. Sounds like people are dropping off in flies.
That's okay. Whoever wants to stay on can stay on. That's a point too, and I think that idea of when you're working in an interdisciplinary team like this, like I said, you might not 100% agree with a particular definition or a particular framing, but the team as a whole is operating in the spirit of, we've got to find some common ground. So some people are going to have to give up a little bit of the things they might have formerly been attached to come up with these sort of common terminologies and common frameworks. And in fact, at some point, if the set of people want to go off and, write about that particular issue of why that definition is, problematic in one way or another, that's fine too. I mean, that's part of the beauty of working in a cross-disciplinary social ecological team like this, is that you do come up with these different perspectives on different aspects of this that doesn't make it right or wrong. It depends on your vantage point, and it depends on where you're situated. So I think that's part of the fun of this project, is going through those processes. Fun, but mostly fun. Do you have anything you wanted to chime in with before we the webinar and the call?
Just see all this, so I really appreciate that you two did this. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, right. I mean, I think this is really questions and provide some good fodder for us to move forward with as this framework and the project as a whole. So, anybody try this out. Going. I really appreciate you taking the time today. And, we'll see you next time.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
bye.
Bye.